This is TAS Education and Career Center's Social Studies Fall 2017 class. We are reading Rethinking Rural, Global Community and Economic Development in the Small Town West, and this is Chapter 5. Chapter 5 deals with Western water, and it looks at water usage in modern times related to agriculture, industrial and municipal uses, biodiversity and amenities, and then the major problems facing Western water. And there's a quote by Dr. Ismail Serageldin, former vice president of the World Bank, who famously stated in 1995, "If the wars of this century were fought over oil, the wars over the next century will be fought over water." So we all know that water and water usage is probably one of the most important issues facing our modern life. And so we're going to look at, in particularly, water usage in the West. So the author starts the section on agriculture by describing driving through the Nevada desert, where you could go 70 miles and not see anything, 100 miles and not see anything, and how it's kind of all barren and dry, and there's no trees and no green, and maybe even 500 miles and you don't see anything. And so the West are sort of known for this large expanses and how of land, and how there are these kind of Erie canals that are transporting water from water-rich rivers in Colorado and Northern California all the way down into LA and Las Vegas and Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson, that naturally would be very barren and dry. And so it's kind of an interesting section if you read it, where he's really just describing more what it looks like. And then he gets into a very detailed description of how the West is so incredibly dependent on irrigation for its farmland, and how the United States as a whole really depends on the West for these irrigated farmlands. So the question becomes, what happens if this irrigation supply dwindles, or the system breaks, or there's not enough water, or really what is the future of these huge Western cities? Phoenix is now the fourth biggest state or city in the nation, and Las Vegas is huge, LA is huge, and these are naturally very barren areas. So what does the future hold for them if we were to run out of water? There's a link here about water in the West. Stanford University has a huge project looking at water issues in the West. So if you're interested and want to delve more into it, go ahead and do that. And so read through here, and then there are 4 questions to look at. We talked about some of them, but one is to know what kind of crops we mainly grow on the irrigated lands. That's important when you're thinking about big picture in terms of our diet and what we mostly eat in the United States, and whether that's sustainable given how much water it takes to actually sustain that practice. And a hint is that very much has to do with beef. And then really describing and summarizing the last 2 paragraphs, where it's talking about what does water scarcity mean for the modern times with huge population growth. We're supposed to have 9 billion by 2050. And so if you could describe in your own words what the author is saying on the last 2 paragraphs on page 81. The next section looks at industrial and municipal uses of water in the West. If you don't know what the word municipal means, or municipality, look them up right now. Pause the video. And so first we look at this graphic on the bottom left-hand side, and it's looking at how much water goes to different activities. And you can see that one golf course in Palm Springs uses 800 gallons of water a day. Skiing, to make snow for one day of snow at Lake Tahoe Ski Resort, is 400,000 gallons a day. An average swimming pool uses 800,000 gallons, or 18,000 gallons, and a single family home uses about 361 gallons a day. So you can see that while it is important that we're looking at our own water usage, when we're talking about water usage in the West as far as how cities use it, we're much more looking at things like golf courses and ski areas. And cities like Phoenix, if you've ever been there, are famous for their golf courses. It's very popular for retirees to move there and play golf. Also, you see that in Tucson and Las Vegas and Palm Springs and LA. So you can see the amount of water that we're pumping out in order to keep the golf courses open. And likewise, the ski areas. It'd be interesting to find out how much gallons per day we use for a single day of skiing in Taos Ski Valley. The chart up on the upper right-hand side looks at population growth across the United States, and you can see that in the West, and in particular in the Southwest, it's where it's growing the most. Phoenix is now the fourth largest city in the entire nation. And so thinking about how in the world are we going to sustain this growth with our water usage. And then the picture in the background is Owens Valley Lake, which is now almost completely dry. It used to be this enormous, lush, beautiful lake. And back in the early 1900s, when we started to move into the out of the isolation era into the mass society area, but they came up with this huge water project where they pumped all of the water from the Owens Valley area into LA. LA was a barren desert. So the LA we think of now with palm trees and beaches and greenery and Hollywood was largely created by pumping all of the water in from across the state. And in modern times, we now can see the result of what happened to Owens Valley. And you can click on a link there. It's a very good article that kind of explains that. And this is a very typical kind of issue that we face in modern times, where we're starting to see the impact of these decisions that were made 100 years ago about how to use water in the West. And there are 3 questions here to answer on your worksheet. The next section goes back to this idea of biodiversity. Again, if you don't know what that means, look it up. And if you don't remember what amenities means, then go ahead and look it up. They're very important words in general for you to know in your vocabulary. And so this is really looking at preserving water for the sake of fish and wildlife and nature, and for the sake of keeping cultural practices intact, and for having beautiful places for us to go. So we've already talked about this issue quite a bit, but you can read on page 84 and 85, and it gives a pretty good description of what are the 2 sides of the controversy around protecting water. The same would apply to protecting forests or whatever when we protect something for an endangered species. With on one side, the business arguing that we can't afford to shut down huge industries for one little fish. And on the other side, saying that it's not about the one little fish or the owl or the one species, it's that fish disappearing represents the decline of an entire ecosystem. And that if we don't preserve it, we're going to lose the entire ecosystem upon which humans depend. And there's a really good link here to an article about restoring the salmon fisheries and how that is related to the tribal cultural practices in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a very common and widespread issue where people who culturally have a lot of cultural practices that are dependent on the land, just like we have here at Taos Pueblo. And what happens when the land or the waterways are so degraded that those cultural people can no longer practice their customs and traditions. So I encourage you to look at that, and also to think about what that means even here locally in Taos. And the final section looks at additional problems facing Western water, and it looks at 4 of them. The hydrological system, and what that means is that fails, overall water quality, overall water quantity, and also the impact of invasive species. So I'm not going to go too much into it, but encourage you to read through and answer these questions in each of the different sections. And just on the picture here is one example of hydrological system failure when one of the dams broke. In 1976, the Teton Dam broke, and people died, entire towns were wiped out. And so what will happen in the West is some of these dams that are aging and getting to be very old start to fail. There was another big scare in 1983 that the Lake Powell Dam, the Glen Canyon Dam on Lake Powell, was going to break. We have the very recent example of the levees breaking in Katrina and what happened there and the destruction that happened in New Orleans. So we have a huge issue to face of what happens as our water systems become old. And then you can look as well at the other three issues that the author brings up in this section. And in conclusion, the author really suggests kind of two ways that we can address these issues of water usage in the Western United States. And so you can read through that. These pictures are kind of two very big hints as to what those suggestions are. And then I would also encourage you to think about what your own suggestions are. How could we change water usage even locally and in the Western as a whole, and then as the world? And is it true that we're going to fight wars over water, or is there a way to avoid that? And what really is the future of water usage, not just in the West, but really all over the world?